Hi again. In this video, we're going to continue looking at the SLA statements or the statements about language learning from your course text, moving to statements 10 through 18. All right. So another statement that we engaged with in the book was teachers should present grammatical rules one at a time, and learners should practice each one before going on to another. Now, what we know about language acquisition is that, yes, certain features do tend to be acquired in a predictable order, but learning a second language itself is not linear in development, and that it can ebb and flow, and learners can acquire one way of communicating and then lose that structure and then pick it up again later. So presenting grammatical rules one at a time and fully mastering one before moving to another isn't really realistic. We know that language development involves this process of integrating new forms and patterns into that interlanguage or that kind of translanguaging space in which the student is making sense of these different features of the language and figuring out which ones belong to the language that they're acquiring. So some important pedagogical implications then are, we should, of course, teach some rules and support students in understanding grammatical rules, but really focusing on function. So using language to do what, right? What is the purpose of the language use, rather than focusing on kind of decontextualized rules. And also engaging with that learning in really meaningful contexts of use. And it's also important to recognize that learners might not master one rule and then move to another, but to have kind of repeated practice or spiraling as they continue to develop in the language, continuing to kind of spiral that learning. Number 11, teachers should teach simple language structures before complex ones. So this is kind of a similar idea. We know again that yes, that certain structures do tend to be acquired before others. However, that doesn't mean we should only expose students to simple structures before we start to teach more complex language. I included this visual that we've seen in an earlier week because we know that students are simultaneously, even at the early stages of language acquisition, developing vocabulary, developing language forms and conventions, and developing linguistic complexity. So all of that is happening simultaneously. We also know that second language learners benefit from receiving modified output, they benefit from the modified output that's produced by native speakers or fluent bilinguals or other more proficient peers. So that again speaks to the interaction hypothesis or the importance of comprehensible output, and that through that interaction, they get access to more complex language forms. There's a negotiation of meaning. So there's other ways for output, for input to become comprehensible when learners are receiving that from their peers or from others that they're engaging with in interaction. We also know that there are certain forms that might only be encountered in classrooms. So it is important to teach some of those forms, simple or complex, because students might not encounter them outside of classroom spaces. All right, so pedagogical implications. One, going back to interaction, students need ample opportunities for negotiating meaning so they can hear and produce the language in a range of contexts. It is important to explicitly teach some forms that students might not encounter otherwise outside of the classroom space, but to also do that in thinking about how we can provide supports and access to word, sentence, and discourse levels of language. All right, number 12. Learners' errors should be corrected as soon as they are made in order to prevent the formation of bad habits. So here, it depends. We know that errors are a natural part of language learning and are important because they can show gaps in knowledge. They can show when students are overgeneralizing of an L2 pattern. So one common example for this is adding ed to make a word plural, rather than using irregular forms of the verb in English. So saying something like goed instead of went is overgeneralizing a pattern that's used in English, or negative transfers of patterns from the first language to the second language. So all of those are examples of errors that are really evidence of the student beginning to make connections and beginning to learn. So it is important to have some form focus instruction and feedback on those errors. However, it's also important to remember that errors could be a part of the developmental stage that the learner is at. If we think back to Schmidt's noticing hypothesis, a learner might not be ready to notice and thus kind of absorb that rule or that formula for language if they're not at that stage yet. And we also know that excessive feedback can negatively impact a student's motivation to learn, right? So how do we think about feedback in a way that's positive and is supporting the learner to develop in their language? So some pedagogical implications, correct errors when a concept has already been taught. So if you've already focused on that concept, that's a good place to make some corrections and give some feedback, or if it's impeding understanding. And also being strategic about what is corrected. So really focusing on meaning making, but strategically giving feedback on forms as relevant and as needed. Oh, number 13, teachers should use materials that expose students only to language structures they have already been taught. And we know that that is false because if you're only learning about structures you've already been taught, you're not advancing in your language acquisition. We know from Krashen's theory of comprehensible input that language acquisition happens with I plus one, and that plus one, what is just above your current I level, is really important. And a similar idea, although focused on learning, not language input, is Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, right? And that's about getting into that zone of what the learner can do with help or with supports, right? Not what they already can do, but getting into that zone where they're pushed. So we know learners can comprehend texts and oral language that has vocabulary and structures that they haven't yet mastered, as long as they have appropriate supports, as long as the input is made comprehensible. And you likely remember from watching Dr. Krashen's video, he used a lot of German. He didn't just say Hand, right? He said, Das ist meine Hand. He used the whole sentence. So he's using structures that maybe you don't know yet if you're just learning German, but he's making it comprehensible so that you're absorbing some words and getting the basic gist of what is being said. So pedagogical implications provide a range of supports so that students can access the more complex language. So using visuals, graphic organizers, total physical response, bolding keywords, highlighting text, modifying text as needed, amplifying the meaning, having students work with a peer as a support, all of these different ways that we can make sure that the students can access more complex language so that they can be engaging beyond with language beyond what they already know, right? Aim for message abundancy. How many different ways can you communicate the message to students? All right, number 14, when learners are allowed to interact freely, for example, in group or pair activities, they copy each other's mistakes. Hopefully you said this was a myth because, well, yes, it is true that if learners, especially if a group of second language learners are working together, they may be making mistakes together. It's also true that the benefits of that kind of interaction far outweigh the disadvantages. If we think about sociocultural theory and this idea that learning is fundamentally mediated, right? So learning is fundamentally social. Then we know that it's important for students to make sense with other people. And we also know that most classrooms will have students who are at different stages of L2 learning, regardless of the model or type of classroom you're working within, regardless of who the students are. I would venture to guess that most of you do not have a classroom where all of the students are at exactly the same level. So by putting them in groups, they will be negotiating for meaning, which will support the L2 development of all the learners, right? And if we think about Swain's comprehensible output hypothesis, as they're negotiating for meaning, they might recognize things that they don't yet know how to say and then find out how to say that. They might begin to kind of focus on what they still need to learn as a result of that interaction. And we know that with Long's interaction hypothesis, that students will be negotiating for meaning. And if they're working with a peer who is a more proficient speaker of that language, that peer might make some modifications to help them better understand what they're trying to communicate. And the learner might then also recognize if what they're saying is comprehensible or not. So much can happen when students interact in groups. So pedagogical implications. Strategic grouping is important. So sometimes you might want to put students together who have the same home language. Sometimes you want them with a more proficient speaker of the second language. So thinking about what the goal is of the activity and how mixing the groups could strategically support learners in different ways. And of course, just incorporating a wide range of peer and group activities with intentional scaffolds to support students in their language use and learning. Number 15, students learn what they are taught. Well, I'm sure anyone who is currently a classroom teacher laughed at this statement because we know students don't learn everything they are taught. And we also know that students learn things that no one ever explicitly teaches them. So it might not be the goal of the lesson, but they might come away with new learning as a result anyway. Um, and it also depends on how students are engaging with the material, what they're doing with the material. I love this visual that shows kind of some estimated retention rates of learning. And it shows, that students tend to remember things best if they've actually practiced doing it or had a discussion about it or been able to teach somebody else it, right? And you can see this nice alignment here with a flip-flopped version of a flipped version of Bloom's taxonomy. So depending on how they were taught it and how they were able to engage with it matters as well. So some pedagogical implications are students need a mixture of targeted language instruction and lots of opportunities to engage with a wide range of language for meaningful purposes. And it's really important to make sure that instruction is not mostly teacher-centered and receptive oriented, so they're just taking in the language, but that they have an opportunity to discuss and practice doing it to teach others. All right, number 16, teachers should respond to students' errors by correctly rephrasing what they have said rather than by explicitly pointing out the error. So this one is an interesting one. We do know that recasts are the most common way that teachers give feedback to students in second classrooms where they're learning a new language. You see this example that is from your book of the young child saying, "I putted the plates on the table," and the mom rephrasing it, "You mean I put the plates on the table?" And he says, "No, I putted them on all by myself." So clearly not being receptive to that recast. We do know that when teachers use recasting as a feedback strategy, learners tend to like that kind of feedback. They do often perceive it as corrective and make changes as a result. However, sometimes recasts might not be understood as that. They might be misinterpreted and viewed just as a confirmation of what they said rather than correcting the form that they used incorrectly. So it is important that if you are recasting, that you are making it explicit what you are recasting. So perhaps if this mother had said, "You mean I put the plates on the table," maybe it would have come through, although it doesn't always, right? But your tone, gestures, facial expression can help. So some pedagogical implications here. Use recast strategically. Sometimes it is helpful to actually correct the form, but in a lot of times it's helpful to just kind of keep the conversation going and draw attention to forms only when needed. But using recasting as a strategy when you notice that a student has used something incorrectly to give them the correct form. Number 17, students can learn both language and academic content, for example, science or history, simultaneously in classes where the subject matter is taught in their second language. Yes, they can. And we know that this is one of the most effective ways to learn a new language. As you saw with Thomas and Collier's chart showing the different program models, the ones in which students are learning content as they're learning language are by far the most effective for MLLs learning English, and they can be a really effective way for native English speakers to also acquire a new language. There's so much research that's been done in this area. My own research focuses in this area, and we know that these program models can be really effective. You saw some examples of this when you watched that pre-K video with the lesson about pumpkins, right? How students were learning language as they were learning content. And this is how much of the world teaches students a second language. So this is a common way of language acquisition. However, we know that to be especially effective, it's important that these models do have some form-focused instruction as well, that it's not just an acquisition environment, but they also do kind of attend to form so students receive both of that targeted support. And finally, number 18, classrooms are good places to learn about language, but not for learning how to use language. So we know that classrooms can and should be good places for learning how to use language, not just learning about language. From a world language instruction perspective, this means that it's important to increase attention to communicative language teaching models. So to think about how you can create spaces for students to not just learn rules, but have lots of opportunities to practice using the language for different meaningful purposes. So maybe thinking about how would you order something at a restaurant rather than just, this is the present tense of the verb. Now let's conjugate it. And for those of you who work with multilingual learners or bilingual learners and are teaching language through content, or supporting a student who's learning English through content, it's important to think about the function of language, right? So a functional approach to language acquisition. And that's the approach that informs WIDA, and we talked about when we discussed the WIDA standards. So thinking about using language to narrate, to inform, to explain, to argue, and what it means to do that, what it looks like to do that. So some pedagogical implications then are to teach language with purpose. So continually be asking yourself, what are we using language to do? I really like the way Michael Halliday frames like how we should think about language in the classroom, that we should teach about language. So kind of thinking metalinguistically about how language is structured, teach language, specific words and phrases and structures, and also teach through language. So engaging students in content, regardless of whether you are a world language teacher or a second grade teacher or a high school science teacher, teaching some content through the medium of language. Those three ways together are effective, the most effective for supporting students to learn language. So I hope that this, again, helps you kind of think about all the different pieces of SLA theory and research that we've been engaging with and how it connects. As you continue to reflect on your own kind of shifts in your thinking, I hope this will support you in making some connections yourself to where you feel kind of more confirmed in your original thinking, or you feel like you have some new ideas for why your mindset has shifted around a particular statement.